when I know I shouldn't do something, and I just say to heck with it, and I just take this big leap, right into the tiger's
Yeah.
mouth.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Joe.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Fire Pit Chat with Ben and Joe. I'm Joe, and hey, Ben, how are you?
Doing well, man. Always good to be together and to talk. So looking forward to this.
So, I wanted to talk a little bit about, mindset, a relationship to change in our lives, and how faith can possibly help us with that. So, what is my mindset or relationship to change in my life? Is the saying true? Change isn't difficult. It's my resistance to change that is difficult. Is change best in baby steps or big leaps, or sometimes both? Can change that is not aligned with God's will for me be successful? And how do I use my faith to make changes that need to be made in my life? Well, there's a lot there in those questions.
Yes.
But I think it's been helpful for me to think about changes. We've really, this past almost 12 months now, there have been a lot of changes, whether it's been in our daily life, in our work life, in our church life, in terms of, we couldn't go to church, and then where some of us are still in the live stream. So there's just been a lot of changes. Could be economic changes, could be mourning. There's been a lot of people that have been dealing in terrible, terrible mourning. So I think that saying, we'll start there. There's a saying, change isn't difficult. It's my resistance to change that is difficult. I think that there's some truth in that, but I don't think that's absolute, right?
Hmm.
Because if the change is mourning the death of someone, is it resistance to that death that's difficult? Probably there is a theological realm of that, but it's just also very difficult. We're human, and
Yeah.
if someone leaves our life, that's going to be difficult, whether I resist it or not. So
Yeah.
I think that it brings mourning into that, but I think it's probably a generic way to say I do resist change, and sometimes I think my resistance is greater than the impact of the change on my life,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
makes it more difficult, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
It makes total sense. Yeah, I mean, I think that it seems to me that that phrase is trying maybe to get at the fact that change is going to happen whether you decide to make changes or not. In other words, it's very easy to think of change in terms of what changes should I be trying to make. And I think that question almost turns it around. Maybe the question is not always so much what changes should I be trying to make as much as how am I going to respond to changes that are just going to happen, which is another way of maybe saying what changes do I need to make internally to be able to respond well to the external changes over which I don't always have a lot of control. Sometimes I do, but very often I don't. And so it's kind of shifting the focus to the inward. How am I fighting against maybe things that are happening in my life from within? You've rightly pointed out. I mean, it's not like just a kind of blithe acceptance of everything that happens in the world is some kind of sign of virtue. I mean, there actually are changes that happen to which I think the appropriate inward response is to be profoundly upset. We talked about this before, even, looking at the emotional life of Jesus. Jesus was not just like, oh, whatever, man, it's all good all the time. That was not his internal life. So yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I think I understand and I appreciate what that statement is getting at. I don't think it's the whole story.
Right. And I think part of that is I may make that, if the only constant in life is change,
Right, right,
right?
right,
So that's the only thing that's going to be constant that I can count on, is that
right.
there's going to be change. And so do I make it worse by resisting the
Mm,
change? Do,
mm.
do I do I put
Yes,
myself into a place of suffering by
yes,
ignoring or trying to reject that
yes.
reality, if it's a reality? But I guess I started with that because I don't I used to I used to hear that a lot in recovery, and I would take that personally as if I'm doing something wrong by
Mm,
feeling a certain way,
mm.
the way I'm feeling. And I think it's more for me properly is that yes, I have to look at my resistance, because that's going to be a piece of it.
Hmm.
but also accept that change is difficult too in
Hmm.
certain areas like
Hmm.
loss or
Oh yeah.
losing your job, or if you don't have money. So the goal there, I think, is to root out my resistance. And I think when we ask about faith, for me, faith, my relationship to God helps me root out my resistance and can calm it a little bit.
Okay, so maybe in light of that, we should think about two different kinds of resistance, because it seems to me there's there's destructive resistance, and there actually can be constructive resistance to certain changes that happen in my life. So, for example, it seems to me that mourning, grieving, is a kind of constructive resistance because it's a kind of internal protest against death having the ultimate say. Life and death are not equal. They're not equally good. You know, there's clearly something in us that just instinctively understands life is what we're for, and we were not made for death and decay. And so there's a kind of internal registering of this isn't how it's supposed to be. But then faith in God, I think, is what keeps the internal resistance to things that happen constructive, as opposed to then that just morphing into bitterness and despair. And I mean, we could go, there's a whole gamut of self-destructive things that can happen when you're just like, I can't deal with whatever it is. Faith is what enables us to say there are things that are wrong, there are things that need to be answered and responded to and pushed back against, but there's a way of doing that from faith that enables us to ultimately be moving toward goodness with our resistance, as opposed to just throwing a tantrum or just kind of smashing things because of despair. Like, everything's unraveling, so what the hell, I'm just going to, like, why not just join in the mayhem kind of thing, which you sometimes see. And so I think we almost have to parse resistance a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think that's great because yeah, I could be destructive in my resistance. So if I lose my job
Mm.
and I don't want to accept that change, I could be destructive. I could spend a lot of money on an attorney on a frivolous lawsuit because I want to make them pay, right?
Mm-hmm.
I could harass my older coworkers
Yep.
and talk bad about the company, and that's
Yep.
destructive resistance.
Yep.
Constructive resistance would be maybe getting a resume and writing that resume with an angry heart. But
Yeah.
I've accepted it and said, okay, I'm going to do this. I really don't want to, but I'm going to do this, and maybe they shouldn't have let me go or whatever that is. But I do think, yeah, I can make it worse for myself by being resistant to the change. I also think besides parsing that, and I love that, parsing the resistance, is you're going to need to parse the change. There is some change that's imposed on me, like losing
Yes.
my job, and some change that I may want to take on.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so for me, what's that? What's the source of that? What's the source of
Right.
me wanting to make that change? Certainly, if it's imposed on me, I have to deal with it. But if I want to spur that, if I want to spark that change, I keep coming back to God's will, and to me,
Yeah.
it's a central piece. In
Yes.
that when I want to make change, if I'm not aligned with God's will, I want to make change, and it's just off. It's just so hard. It's so hard to succeed. Obstacles keep coming up. Trying to get that, round peg in the square hole.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when I want to make that change aligned to God's will, it may be difficult and hard and tough. But if I'm aligned to God's will, I can do that. And that's, I think, where we get to the baby steps or big leaps
Yeah.
of faith. And I don't think there's one answer.
I agree. I agree. I was just thinking about the question about baby steps and big leaps, and I really appreciate you keeping us anchored to this central idea of God's will. So, one of the things that I think sometimes is true of us is that we all at times lack imagination. I think sometimes it's just easy to settle. It's easy to almost use baby steps as a way of not imagining maybe some really big stuff that could be exciting and that could rearrange a whole lot of our lives. On the other hand, the beauty of the baby steps thing is that all of life is incremental. I mean, we don't walk by leaping, we walk by taking steps. And that's it's almost like that physical motion of walking is a constant reminder. You can only get so far at a time. Yet we don't teleport.
Right.
And so I think it's both. I mean, I think God's will for us is both very, very grand. His vision for his human creatures is just so much more glorious than ours tends to be. But on the other hand, you got to start somewhere. And so I'd say both and.
Yeah, I think there are some cases where I can actually use both of those in God's will and outside of God's will. So, for
Right.
example, to your side, baby steps might be okay. I'm going to just, methodically go through this and make sure whatever this change is, I'm going to dot my I's and cross my T's. And baby steps could be, I'll deal with it next week. Baby
Yeah.
steps, I'm going to push it off. And I think those are two
Yep.
different. And a big leap could be, I'm connected, and I'm talking to friends. I'm connected. I'm praying and meditating, and I just got to make this big jump. But it's done after I've really made sure I'm aligned here inside. And
Mm-hmm.
other times when I know I shouldn't do something, and I just say to heck with it, and I just take this big leap, right into the tiger's
Yeah.
mouth.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Joe. Yeah.
So I think both of those again comes down not only to God's will, which some people might think is mystical or outside of themselves or not attainable or can't be heard, but it's me putting in that effort to seek it, right? To
Hmm.
honestly, I was reading something this week, humbly and boldly seek it. And to
Yeah.
me, those words are opposites. How could I humbly and boldly seek God's will?
Mm.
And so I'm sitting with that, and I'm starting to warm up to that idea that I can be humbly seeking God's will and then boldly take that big leap because
Yeah.
it feels like this is what I'm supposed to do next.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, an awareness of our own limitations, our own frailty, our own finitude, where I'm not going to try to, act in some sort of godlike way of you know, just getting. You've talked so many times about right sizing. There's the right sizing of myself that comes in God's presence. But on the other hand, because God is my Father, and because he does amazing things in our lives when we are willing to trust and obey, and we don't want to limit him. Sometimes I think the best way to honor God is to be pretty venturesome, like take some risks. There's a missionary, I think in the 19th century, who said, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. And it's the expectation that allows the attempt, right? I mean, God is great. So maybe I try some stuff that might look crazy to other people, but that can also, as you've just said, can be a kind of recklessness that's all about me too. And so back to the heart issue before God, I think that's the being in his presence, and just sort of constantly evaluating, before him, is this about me, or is this about, ultimately trying to honor him?
And I think that comes into play God's will with changes that are I perceive were imposed on me. If you go back
Hmm.
to that example, and I lost my job, right? So if someone loses their job, that was imposed on them. That could be God's will too.
Yeah.
You know, God may have been trying to get you out of that job into somewhere else, and I
Yep.
was resisting it or not taking that baby step or that big leap. So I didn't take that big leap. So God took it for me. Just
Hmm.
took the job away.
Yeah, because I would never make a change that leads into suffering, right? That wouldn't. Most of my attempted changes are always about avoiding suffering.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's just amazing how much good work God does in us through suffering. So yeah, I love what you've said, and I do think, to this question about change that's aligned with God's will. One of the great things about living in God's grace with Him as a Father, we're at peace with Him through Jesus, is that there's room for some trial and error. It's not like you got to find just the right formula about this all the time. Sometimes we make some changes and we realize in retrospect, wow, I was kind of full of myself. Or, man, I hedged my bets and I didn't take a step that would have really been fruitful. I just didn't trust God. I was living out of insecurity or whatever. But it's okay. I mean, I think we've talked about this before. If you're a coach and you're just screaming at your players every time they make a mistake, you're going to paralyze them. They need some kind of elasticity, sometimes you make mistakes. That's You're not out of the game.
Yeah, I think it's that role reversal piece, meaning
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
what would I need in that situation,
Hmm.
right? What if I was in that situation? What would I need, or what would I want to say? And sometimes
Yes.
I try to do that with God. I know I'm not God, but I try to do that, and that helps me see God in a different light and
Yes.
see His will for me in a different light. Because again,
Yes.
God's not just a better version of me.
Right.
He is not he's not me at all. He's way better. And so, but sometimes I'll try to do that role reversal, and I do that with my kids and in other
Hmm.
relationships, and I think it's important. But my relationship with God is a relationship just like those are, and so I
Hmm.
need to bring those tools into that relationship as
Hmm.
well. And in
Yeah.
aligning myself with God's will, I'm not losing anything. I'm gaining much more than I'll ever lose.
Yes. Yes.
And so that
Amen.
that change is going to be welcome in me
Right.
when I get to the other side. And to your point, I wouldn't choose suffering, and suffering does happen with changes, certainly ones that are imposed on us, and maybe other ones we make and we don't realize, what we
Hmm.
just signed up for.
Mm.
But to that other side, if I'd stayed faithful and I'm still aligned with God's will, I can look back and see the growth. And then, as you said this weekend, then look forward, right? Look
Yeah.
forward to the future and the grace and all the wonderful things that are ahead of me.
So the central focus is not necessarily outcomes as much as the relationship with God. Is it
Yeah, yeah,
which
yeah.
yeah.
That's what I see, and because if I know by me taking my own inventory about all the things that I need to change, I know where that ends up. I mean,
Right.
that's been my life,
Right.
and from that point where I cross the threshold into faith, where I cross that threshold into relationship with God, and learned about God's will and seeking God's will, I have now a lot of experiences of the
Mm.
benefits of doing that. So
Yeah.
I have to align for me it's maintaining this consciousness that God is there. God
Mm.
has a will not to control me or destroy me or
Hmm.
stifle me or do anything other than have me thrive,
Mm.
and just be conscious of that, and just know that I don't have all the answers. I
Right.
don't have a lot of answers, but I have, 2 feet, two
Yep.
eyes, a heart,
Yep.
and a hands, as you
Yep.
talked about. And I just need to put those, to work. And it's the resistance. I think that's where the ultimate resistance is. It's probably
Mm.
letting go and letting God. The
Yes.
ultimate
Yeah.
resistance is I'm not God, but yet I want to play God. I want to play chess with God. I want to think
Yeah.
along. I want to scheme along with God. And He doesn't need me to do any of that.
No, I love that. I think if I'm fundamentally convinced that I really don't know ultimately what's best for me, God does, then a lot of my resistance is just going to be against my just what you were saying, against my own attempts to kind of grab that place of sovereignty and plan my life accordingly. I know where that leads. And that's the difference.
Yeah, I've got a lot of evidence. I got a lot of
And
evidence.
yeah, but that's really helpful.
All right. So changes, we might be thinking about changes. Certainly, we hope you don't change your listening patterns if you are listening to us, unless that's God's will. Then we're all for it. But hopefully not. And Ben, this was great. I really appreciate it. It certainly opened my mind to some new ideas and new ways of seeing things. And I definitely feel encouraged to take both baby steps and big leaps.
Amen. Let's do it.